All right, we are now recording, Pam, and today I'm interviewing Pam Scott at the Buckeye Ranch. I'm Gil Greene, one of the originators of IFAST, Integrative Family Systems Treatment. So, Pam, I always start off by you saying a little bit about yourself and about how Buckeye Ranch. Say a little bit about Buckeye Ranch and
Okay.
then how Buckeye Ranch came to using IFAST.
Well, Pam Scott. I am currently the Director of Professional and Clinical Development at the Buckeye Ranch. Prior to this position, I had been involved in our community-based programs. I supervised our outpatient program, but we worked very closely with our other home-based programs. The Buckeye Ranch actually started out 60 plus years ago as a residential treatment facility. But over time, our agency, like so many agencies, recognized that it's not adequate to bring kids from their homes, put them in a residential facility for up to 2 years, even with shorter stays, and then send them back home and expect everything to work out. We learned through experience that you have to work with the families. So in probably the mid 90s and then into the early 2000s, we really began to grow our services that worked in the community with families. And eventually, as our community based programs that worked with families and our outpatient program began to grow, we realized that we needed a model that was consistent, that we could use across our programs, and that we could train from so that we could have shared language and a shared assumption, and we could have more consistency and be able to know that our clinicians, our community support folks that were going out and working with families had good training, solid supervision, and that there was consistency around it. And so we started looking for models. My former boss at the time had some connections with OSU, and eventually we landed on IFAST. And that was in 2007, I believe. So we've been doing IFAST for about 17 years.
Yeah, you discovered iFast before we had really published anything off of it. If I recall, your former boss, uh,
Mm-hmm.
it was the mention of the research on iFast was on the College of Social Work's website, and I think that's where she saw it. But at that point, we had not published anything on it yet.
Right. So we were early adopters, I will say.
We were, yeah. I think got an email from her or you inquiring about it, and I was really surprised, pleasantly surprised. You inquired about iFast, and then you were the very first agency to buy the training in iFast and go for certification.
And at the time, I mean, in retrospect, it's certainly been to our advantage to have the relationship we have with OSU and have you and other developers there so that we can have that close communication and interaction. But in terms of the model itself, the advantages for us as an organization, one was the flexibility that it allowed us to maintain our current structure. We weren't forced to restructure our organization or our programs in any way so that our programs met a structure that IFAST required. We could adapt the model to our structure, to our organization, and it allowed us that in and of itself made it more affordable as opposed to some other models out there that are very effective with a perhaps narrower population, but also have requirements that can impact how you have to structure your organization.
So you're still using iFast after all these years. So is that one of the reasons why you still still use iFast? I mean,
It is one of the reasons. I think that I iFast fits very much with our principles, what we call our principles of quality care at the Buckeye Ranch, which are principles that we teach across the organization because we also have non-clinical programs. We have child welfare and foster care and case management entity, and so other programs that are not necessarily clinical. And we think it's very important that we have shared principles across all of our organizations so that when someone comes to the Buckeye Ranch, we have a lot of families who move through levels of care with us, are in multiple programs. We want there to be something consistent that sort of represents the DNA of the Buckeye Ranch. And so we call those our principles of quality care. And iFast fits in perfectly with those. One of them is being strength-based, and iFast is a very strength-based model, which has been very critical for us as we teach the folks the new clinicians that are coming in how to take a strength-based approach, not just with the child, but in particular with the parent who may be presenting with behaviors that are troubling. So the other principle that it particularly aligns with is that we're family centered and that we believe that the best place for a child is in the home with the family, and that we need to start by working with parents and enabling parents to be the ones that are the agents of change for their children. And that is very much embedded in iFast. So having that consistency in terms of our principles and undergirding principles of iFast, and then building a structure. The other thing that we did, one of the things we were taught early on with iFast, and one of the initial underlying principles I remember reading, is that in order for there to be success, an agency, clinicians have to get consistent and good supervision. So when we started iFast, we were able to structure the calendars of our clinicians so that there was 2 hours every other week of group supervision around iFast. And we would do an hour of didactic and then do an hour of a case presentation. And over the years, we've had a lot of changes in supervisors. We've had changes in structure. We've had times where things have been really great, and we've had times where things haven't been so great. But the one thing we have always done is sort of keep sacred that 2 hours every other week of iFast, and having that consistency built in so that our clinicians get that 2 hours every other week, along with individual supervision with their supervisor. But it allowed us to build a training program around iFast, and also just kept that language out there, kept that consistency. And I think had we not been just sort of that set in stone, that doesn't change, over the years with turnover and things like that, it probably would have waned. And I think that was one of the better decisions we made.
a couple of things you mentioned I want to follow up on is so it sounds like what you're saying, I'm asking this for clarification, is so you everybody who you hire, regardless of what program, they get trained in iFast
In our clinical programs.
in your clinical programs.
In our clinical programs. Everybody we hire across the agency, we introduce, and this more so these last few years as we've been able to build more resources, but everyone gets introduced to our principles of quality care. The iFast model is used in our clinical programs. and in those programs that work specifically with families. We have school-based programs where we go into the schools and they don't necessarily use it. But all of our clinical programs that work directly with kids and families get trained in IFAST.
So it gives everybody who works clinically a common language, then a common framework.
Yes.
Okay. And also you have an IFAST team?
We have a team that does intensive home-based therapy, which is really, to be frank, it's a code utilized by the state, by Medicaid.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an intensive in-home program. And you have the flexibility if you do IHBT within their parameters, which have to do with frequency of meeting and some intensity and some of that sort of thing, to utilize whatever model that you want. We utilize IFAST as the model in our IHBT, but we also use IFAST as our model for our other home-based programs that aren't necessarily designated as intensive home-based per the state. We do have two evidence-based models, MST and FFT, that we also do have teams that do those. So
Right.
They are not doing IFAST.
Right. And also you use or have used IFAST in outpatient?
Yes.
How well does that work in outpatient?
Well, it worked well. It worked fine. And I think it allowed us, I supervised that program for several years, and it allowed us to set a goal of, when I first came in and was supervising that program, our proportion of family therapy to individual therapy was highly skewed toward individual therapy. And so we worked really hard.
Individual therapy with the kids.
With the kids, yes. And so one of the things that bringing IFAST on did for us is really help us set that priority that we need to be doing family therapy, and it needs to be rare occasions in which we do individual therapy. And we were able over time to switch those proportions so that the majority of the sessions were family therapy, but it taught us skills. Number one, it prioritized it. It taught us the importance of working with the family, and then skills for joining with reluctant parents who may feel they don't need to be there, or they've been blamed and they're reluctant to be involved, or they've just lost hope and they feel like their child needs a professional and that they're not competent to help with that. So IFAST really helped us build skills in making connections, building therapeutic alliances with parents. Mm-hmm. Initially, perhaps through phone calls, and then eventually getting them into treatment.
So yeah, that goes along with one of the basic tenets of IFAST, is that empowering at least one parent or caretaker to be the one to solve the kid's problem.
Right.
And you've been able to do that, it sounds like.
And that is consistent then with the two models that we do use that are evidence-based models, MST, multi-systemic therapy, and functional family therapy. Both of those models are also models that prioritize family, prioritize parents, and working. FFT is very focused on working with the whole family. MST is very much about focusing on the parents and not necessarily in developing a therapeutic alliance with the child. They want the parent to have that alliance with the child, mm-hmm. that connection with the child. So there's consistency in that prioritization across IFAST and the other programs that we have, the other models that we use.
Good. And then the second thing I wanted to follow up with you on is about the supervision. And you're talking about how um, you do IFAST supervision 2 hours every other week. Um, and of course, one of the other things about IFAST, I think it supports its flexibility, excuse me, is in certification process. IFAST doesn't certify agencies necessarily certify supervisors.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's the trainer model. And so how well is that you've been able to implement that? Sounds like it's worked for you.
We have been fortunate, and I'm sitting here thinking back. The majority, if not outside again of MST and FFT, those clinical supervisors we have in our community based grew up in the Buckeye Ranch. So they were supervised, they learned either as interns with us and or direct hires by supervisors who were initially trained by the developers, by you, by Dave, by Andy. And so we had a whole group of supervisors who were directly trained by the developers. Over time, we've had turnover with those supervisors. And so we sort of have second generation now supervisors, but they are supervisors who spent years under the supervision of someone who had been directly trained by that, and then had been involved in eventually taking on interns and using that model to work with their interns, and just sort of immersion in that.
Mm-hmm.
We have not had to bring on a new supervisor from outside and teach them IFAST from scratch.
Okay.
We've actually never had to do that.
Okay. Yeah. I hadn't heard that before, but yeah, that makes sense. That's good. Yeah. Um, so you've been with IFAST, using IFAST since 2007. So I take it you do that because you like the flexibility, but also it gets the results, good clinical outcomes.
Well, we were able, so it's been several years, but after we had gone through training, and then after a year of being trained by Andy and Dave, and then the second year, they worked with just the supervisors.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were on our own. And at that point, you folks did an evaluation, and we were able to gather data. And because at that time we had an MST team, we were able to gather data from our MST team and from our folks doing IFAST, and be able to look at our outcomes and do a comparison. And that was a really lovely piece of research that came out of that, because we were able to demonstrate through that a couple of things that were really, I think, very significant. First, we were able to demonstrate that our outcomes were equivalent to MST's outcomes, or a little bit better, not statistically significantly better, but better. We didn't have any outcomes that were worse than MST's outcomes. But the other thing that was really important when we looked at the data after, once it was analyzed, was when you looked at the standard deviation around the presenting problem when they came in, MST had a very narrow standard deviation. In other words, their folks that come in, they know their population. That model was developed for a very particular population. It was tested on a very particular population, and it is utilized for a very particular population. And it works. I mean, they get good outcomes. And so for that population, the model has shown itself to be effective. IFAST, we're able to bring any families in. And so the standard deviation we had around the presenting problems for our IFAST group was significantly larger. And so it demonstrated to us that we don't have to be real narrow in the types of presenting problems that came in to our organization, and we could still get equivalent outcomes. So that was really, really encouraging.
So what you're getting at then is MST has very clear, narrow inclusion and exclusion criteria.
Yes.
Whereas IFAST takes whoever walks through the door.
For the most part. I mean, you know, yeah. If we have folks coming in who have, for example, very, very significant autism, that's not a population we serve at our agency. There's other agencies in town that serve that population and do it well. So, you know, there is some discretion that we have in that. But for the most part, it's about getting to know the family, getting to know joining with the parents, letting them tell you what is happening in their family, and letting them tell you, working with them together to identify the problems and identify the goals, and then begin to pay attention to what's working in their family and how we can do more of that.
Mm-hmm. So working with and amplifying their strengths, and working with, as IFAST emphasizes, working with their frames.
Yes. And since this is a bit tangential, but I think it's important. In the 17 years since we've been doing IFAST, the Buckeye Ranch, like a lot of other organizations, has really put a lot of energy and emphasis into building our capacity to do trauma-informed care. Mm-hmm. And what I think is so nice about IFAST is it allows us to develop what we call in IFAST developing therapeutic alliance. We sort of call in trauma-informed care creating a safe relationship. Mm-hmm. But it has to do with the idea that you go in with the assumption that these parents have strengths, and that we can approach that with therapeutic curiosity to discover those things together, which to me is very consistent with trauma-informed care. We're not going in there and demanding that they do something, demanding that they follow a certain script, but that we're creating a place that is safe because we're honoring their story and we're letting them tell us what the problem is and working together with them so that we can begin to help them change the pattern around that. Mm-hmm. And use their frame, which is very validating.
Uh-huh. So you find IFAST fits very nicely with trauma-informed care, working with kids and families with trauma histories.
Yes. And I think, you know, one of the things, again, that I've noticed over the years, working with interns, working with new clinicians, is that a lot of people come into this work and are drawn to our agency in particular because they want to work with children. And we'll even hear folks say, I don't want to work with adults, I want to work with children. And so oftentimes our first job as trainers and supervisors is to help the clinicians understand that your job is to build therapeutic alliances with parents, that you have to be able to recognize their role and your role. And ultimately, for durable change, you have to work with the parents. It's hard a lot of times for new clinicians coming in because they will often automatically blame parents. And so one of the work we had a big piece of the work we had to do initially was our own self-reflection for each of us as supervisors about how frequently we find ourselves blaming the parents or bashing the parents, and how we had to change that perspective for ourselves and our language, and how we framed that when we were talking with clinicians about cases, it wasn't about blaming the parent.
Mm-hmm.
And so helping clinicians be able to see the strengths in parents that may not be on the surface seen, and then be able to develop a therapeutic relationship with those parents. That was really one of the biggest changes that we had to make in our organization, in the culture of our organization, because there were ways that we thought we were doing that we thought that we were aligning with the parents, until we really began to recognize, well, we're aligning with them if they'll allow us to tell them what they need to change, and tell them what they need to do different. So I think that's one of the biggest growth areas for new clinicians and for us as an agency, is to think differently about the language we use about parents, and about how we, and this is where I think it has so much to do with trauma-informed care, because most of the parents we work with have their own histories of trauma. And if we come into them and take away their choice, and start telling them what they're doing wrong, and they have their own trauma histories, we're not going to be able to make that connection.
Right. And without that connection with the parents, you're probably not going to get good outcomes.
Or certainly not outcomes that are going to still look good in 6 months after we have left the family.
Right. Yeah. So what you were saying about working with, well, when you first started with iFast, and then as you hire new employees who they want to work with kids only individually, and you have to train them to broaden their lens. So that brings up the topic of training. And I know from the beginning and over the years, I think you especially have developed a lot of training materials for iFast. You want to talk a little bit about that?
So, as we then began to implement it ourselves, we needed to make sure that all of our supervisors had the capacity to do the training. And so we needed to have some structure around that. And so I was able to read through some of the literature that your folks had produced, and look at the training that we received. And based on the underlying assumptions of iFast, and then based on the common factors that sort of are the structure of iFast around developing a therapeutic alliance with the parents, looking at second order change, at changing the pattern of interaction that is happening, and then systems collaboration, because our kids and families are all involved in multiple systems. So looking at the assumptions and those three common factors, we were able to come up with 12 sort of teaching sessions. And then we could do those every other week for us, then 24-week period. And we would repeat that every year. We would do the 12 training sessions, and then maybe we'd do something different for the didactic part of our iFast supervision. And then we would repeat that, so that we were going through those basic sessions at least once a year, because we all need to go back to basics. We all need to always remember some of those things that are easy to forget if you don't just have that repetition.
Yeah. So you've developed kind of training modules on all the different elements of iFast and the common factors and how to do that. And you've done some, I know in the past, you've done some video recording of, was that part of your training, or having staff do video recordings of their work with families?
We early on did some of that. I will be frank with you, I'm not sure how much of that is happening right now, to be honest. I just don't know. I'm not close enough to the day to day.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember in the early days, I think you were doing that fairly routinely, doing a pretty good job of that, and
Mhm.
especially with the current staff, training them and having them do that. Um, how how well received was that for the staff back then? I mean, a lot of people, a lot of clinicians have trouble if they never video recorded themselves. They have a lot of trouble with that.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I don't like being recorded. I'm pretending right now I'm not. So I understand that. I will say it's like a lot of things. When we first started, and we did 2 years of work with Andy and Dave, and we would bring videos into those. I think it was like a lot of things. It was new, and there was a lot of enthusiasm around it, and we were smaller than we are now.
Yeah,
So there was a real sense of ownership across our initial community-based team, which is where we started that. And I think that helped quite a bit. People were excited and interested in it. I honestly don't know how much, if any, recording is going on right now. We're at a different place as an organization. We had a pandemic. You may have heard of it. and
heard that on the street. Heard that
and to
murmur
be
on the street.
honest, like a lot of agencies right now, we're seeing a level of turnover with our staff that we've not seen ever before in my career. And
That,
that's
that,
not
that,
just
that,
Buckeye Ranch.
no, yes, I hear that happening in a lot of agencies.
Yeah. And so I think that there is, we honestly were at a place when we started iFast where we had more stability in terms of not nearly as much turnover. So we weren't bringing in with as much frequency new people that needed to be trained from scratch. And I think that allowed us, that was certainly good for us. It was put us in a good position to be able to embed it. Right now we're in a little bit different place.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Uh, so anything you want to talk about or emphasize that I haven't asked you about?
We haven't, one of the things that we haven't talked about a whole lot, I think because of the work I've done recently in trauma-informed care, looking at intergenerational trauma, I really do have a passion for having folks see parents differently, having a different perspective. And I think that the foundational ideas in iFast around listening for their frame, validating their frame, and then expanding their frame to help them try something different has been really helpful with that. The one area that we haven't talked about as much that is equally important is then changing the pattern around the behaviors. When you have a good relationship with the parents, when you know their frame, you are in a much better position to introduce perhaps a pattern change idea that they would be more receptive to, or even observe sometimes when they're doing something different and commenting on it and beginning to build their confidence around responding to the problem in a way that is not quite so problem sustaining, and change that. But that is, again, a really key part. And it was one of the things when we first started that we do talk a lot about, is really paying attention to the pattern around the presenting problem and what is the current sort of vicious cycle that get set up by that, and how can we help them change that pattern. But it has to come first from earning the trust
Right.
of the family and believing in the family's capacity to make that change.
Mm-hmm. So you see that as something that's a real critical piece of IFAS. I mean, it goes along with the importance of therapeutic relationship and alliance with the parents, also with the kid,
Mm-hmm.
but especially with the parents. And part of that is learning using their frame to change the vicious cycle.
And identifying their strengths so that you can not offer a suggestion that maybe worked for the last family you worked with, or maybe worked for you, but isn't going to fit with this family's strengths.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're just setting them up for something that's unsustainable if it doesn't already work with their current strengths and frames. So jumping first to problem solving before you've had a chance to get to know the family, get to know their strengths, and get to know the problem from their perspective is counterproductive.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you emphasizing that. It's very critical, very important part that can easily be overlooked.
Yeah.
So for anybody who watched this on YouTube, any agency or clinician out there's what advice would you give them about IFAST?
If you, as an agency, are really committed to working with families, it offers, I think IFAST takes, well, I know that IFAST pulls from existing models that have demonstrated success, was able to kind of boil those down to those essential common factors across them, and then allows flexibility for the agency to be able then to implement that in a way that works for them. But you have to be committed to the fundamentals. You have to be committed to the idea that an agency has a responsibility to train and supervise their clinicians. So for us, one advantage we had is we were committed as an agency prior to this, that we always did weekly clinical supervision with the individuals. We always had that mindset that clinical supervision matters and that you do it, and you do it every week. An agency has to be committed to that and committed to that ongoing sense of their role in developing the clinical skills of the people they work with. If you have that, IFAST then gives you the flexibility to do that within what works for you as an agency.
So IFAST is flexible enough to be able to successfully incorporate interventions from multiple different approaches.
Exactly. And so that it gives clinicians the ability to use what fits with them as well.
Yeah.
We've had clinicians who came up and really felt an affinity around structural family therapy, and they can sustain that. They don't have to be told, well, you need to get rid of that because we're doing this other model. As long as the model is strength-based, as long as the model values the role of the parent, and as long as the model, recognizes we need to be able to change the pattern in a way that works with this family, then you can use a multiple different models, and you can use what fits with the family as well.
Yeah, I mean, that sums things up pretty well. One last thing. What would you say about the cost effectiveness of IFAST?
As I said before, we have two evidence-based models, MST and FFT. We could not continue to do MST if we didn't have contracts with other state agencies like the courts and children's services. It's not affordable. IFAST to me is very cost effective because it gives you a structure and some resources and access to the expertise of the developers and the trainers to be able to offer ongoing training and training to your clinicians, which I think is a critical part of retention. We're all struggling with retention right now, but I will tell you that my observation is the people who leave the fastest are the people who feel like they're thrown in to do a job that they haven't had the training to do and don't feel like they're growing. Mm-hmm. Those are the ones that we see not even making it a year because they just feel abandoned. And so I think everybody's calculated the cost of turnover these days. Anything that you can do to create a place where clinicians feel like they want to be because they're supported and they're growing. And I don't think you can do that without some sort of structure around training and supervision.
Okay, that's great. Those are some good points about the cost effectiveness IFAST. What helps to make it cost effective. Yeah. Anything else before we end here today?
Oh, probably things I'll think about after, but
it always works that way.
We're clearly fans. We wouldn't still be doing it after 17 years if we didn't find it something that worked.
And Buckeye Ranch is one of the top agencies, mental health agencies for kids and families, certainly in Columbus and Franklin County, if not the state of Ohio, with multiple programs. So it's very impressive that you continue with IFAST after all these years.
After all these years.
After all these years. Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Pam, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today and to share your thoughts on IFAST.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.